Today on Stronger Than Reason, we bow to the inevitable and talk about Nirvana, Seattle, and grunge. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So, I wasn't going to do this episode, I really wasn't, but the fact is, I recently took a trip to Seattle, and it brought certain things to the forefront of my mind. Coffee, for instance, and books. I like books. The Mariners are okay. And even salmon. Who doesn't like salmon? I love some perfectly cooked salmon with some asparagus and smashed potatoes on the side. Yum, yum. Also, Seattle reminded me of one of my favorite old underground comics, Peter Bag's Hate, half of which took place in Seattle back in the bad old 90s, and I like to pull Hate out now and then and just reread the whole thing. I think it's a really great story. It's funny and crazy, but also kind of realistic, and it was very much of the time. I also thought about my first trip to Seattle 20 years ago when Mrs. Stronger Than Reason and I did all the usual touristy things, you know, the Space Needle, the Underground, visiting the very first Starbucks, climbing Mount Rainier, part way at least. And yes, lots of books, coffee, and salmon. But wherever I am, I always think about music. And being in Seattle, of course, I remembered that scene from the movie Ray, when Ray Charles runs into Quincy Jones down by the Pike Place Market. I mean, isn't that what everyone thinks of? And I remembered the few years in the early 2000s when KMFDM called Seattle home. If I recall correctly, they recorded their comeback album Attack there. And Bill Rieflin lived there. Of course, he contributed to that album and many other KMFDM albums. And that's where he ran his record label, First World Music, and got involved with Robert Fripp and Trey Gunn, recording some stuff with them, like The Repercussions of Angelic Behavior, and ultimately joining Fripp's King Crimson and playing with Scott McCauley's band, The Minus Five, meeting Peter Buck of REM, and eventually going and joining that band as their permanent touring drummer. One of these days, I'm going to have to do an entire episode on Bill because he had a pretty fascinating career. But I also thought about when the missus and I hit what was then called the Experience Music Project, or EMP. It was situated in a series of buildings at the foot of the Space Needle, and it was an interactive music museum operated by Paul Allen of Microsoft fame. And the whole thing was designed by Frank Gehry, but nevertheless is maybe the ugliest set of buildings I've ever seen, looking like something that the Space Needle vomited up. Just a bunch of random shapes and textures that only vaguely resemble a coherent building. Today I see it's been repurposed as the Museum of Pop Culture, or MoPop, but the EMP was fun back in the day. It was kind of like a Hard Rock Cafe without the expensive food and drinks, had plenty of rock memorabilia on display. In fact, the one thing that sticks out in my head after all these years was that they had, well, of course, one of Al Jorgensen's cowboy hats, and Al had taken a Sharpie to it, and on one side had drawn a peace symbol, and on the other side had drawn an anarchy symbol, which, of course, is pretty great, kind of like an industrial redneck homage to Private Joker's helmet and Full Metal Jacket. Another thing that was pretty awesome is that the EMP had jamming rooms that you could reserve. So, of course, we did that, and it was like going into the live room of a very tiny studio. They had, in that case, an electronic drum kit, a guitar, a bass, a keyboard, and everything was like plugged in and ready to go. So I remember we rocked out in there for 20 minutes or so, and it was just a cool idea because I can imagine that a lot of people normally don't get the opportunity to mess around with real musical instruments, especially not in a relatively judgment-free way like that. So mostly it was just a lot of fun. But there was one thing about Seattle and music that I just couldn't escape. Something that was never really a favorite of mine, but which I guess I inherited in a way as a card-carrying member of Generation X. And that thing was called grunge. Now, at this point, I feel the need to point out something about this show's analytics that is probably obvious, and that is that most of the folks listening to me now are around my age. You know, very handsome and beautiful and intelligent 40 and 50 somethings. So greetings, peeps. Be aware that YouTube knows all of our ages somehow and reports on them, or at least it thinks it knows our ages. I guess, we're all being tracked, of course. But from the comments, it's also clear that there are at least one or two younger folks listening, and I welcome both of you. For your sakes, and maybe to just refresh my aging memory, I'll now recap a bit about grunge and its advent, and also tell a few old war stories. But to adequately do that, I'll have to start at the very beginning. So once upon a time, there was the so-called Summer of Love, and it was in 1969, well before I was born, so I'm not to blame. And it was all about the baby boomers becoming hippies and discovering drugs, free love, and self-indulgence. So fast forward 20 years to the so-called Second Summer of Love in 1989. At this point, the hippies, who hadn't permanently fried their brains, had largely degenerated into helmet-haired Wall Street execs and or fretting parents of the moral majority sort. Meanwhile, their spawn, Generation X, was largely discovering their own fun pairings of music and drugs, namely electronic dance music and ecstasy. Hence the Second Summer of Love. And I'm talking about the general culture here because I, for one, listened to Nancy Reagan and just said no. In fact, I don't know that any of my close friends ever tried ecstasy, or if they did, they didn't tell me about it. I don't know, maybe someone will fess up here and want to talk about it. Anyway, it was a youth culture thing, speaking very generally, holding illegal raves in unlikely spots like abandoned factories, open farmland, or your mom's basement. All you needed were some mates with a big sound system, a decent light show, some drum machines, and you were good to go. And I understand that E accentuated this experience in ways that were, similar to pot and acid and how they accentuated the Woodstock experience. So around this time, it was all about the beats. England was going through its Manchester phase, driven by the neo-psychedelic dance rock acts like the Happy Mondays, the Stone Roses, the Charlatans, and so on. And that culture just spread across the world. It was all fishing hats, smiley face t-shirts, and ridiculously oversized jeans, which I'm happy to say I never owned, although these days I do opt for relaxed fit and not skinny jeans, not only for my sake, but for the sake of everyone else, believe me. Some of my favorite music, of course, is from this era, which is pretty obvious if you've ever listened to this show for any length of time. So albums like New Order's Technique, Nine Inch Nails' Pretty Hate Machine, pretty much all the best stuff from Al Jourgensen and Paul Barker came out around this time. Skinny Puppy's Too Dark Park, and of course, the Mondays, the Roses, and all the rest of it, and on it went. And in some ways, it seemed like the groovy dance party would never end, that it would just go on and on and on like some horrendous, hyper-extended dance mix, maybe by Perfecto or even Sly and Robbie. Needless to say, if we could liken the dance music culture to the stock market for a minute, what was happening was that there was a bubble. Dance culture was overvalued, and in 1990 was due for a strong correction, as the financial analysts say. So the thing that would pierce that bubble and send dance music crashing back to earth would be that most powerful of rock weapons, overdriven, obnoxious, and way too loud guitar power chords. And these power chords were coming largely from one spot on the globe, Seattle. See, folks in Seattle had had enough of electronic bleeping and blooping. They had drop-kicked their drum machines into the dumpster behind the Starbucks, and they had thrown their sequencers into Elliott Bay and traded the smiley face shirts for Dad's flannels. So it was kind of as someone had thrown a big brick into the calm waters of the music world, and the splash hit Seattle, and the waves spread outward from there. Dance music and culture was largely caught up in the wake, and many careers were capsized and overturned. I'm just loving this metaphor here. Anyway, As they do, the music press quickly labeled this movement with a single catchy word, grunge. Grunge, they said, would be the music of the 90s, and as such, it would be diametrically opposed to the synth pop of the 80s, of which the Manchester fad was largely a hangover. So, whereas 80s music was largely synthetic, grunge would be organic. 80s music was overproduced. Grunge would be barely produced. 80s music was airbrushed and perfect. Grunge would be sloppy. 80s music was wimpy. But grunge would be rock and roll shoveled directly up your ass. Singing was out, screaming was in, coiffed hairdos were out, bedhead was in, androgynous costumes were out, jeans and t-shirts were back, and for God's sake, turn up your guitar and play a real damn drum kit. And, for sure, the effects were felt all over the music industry for many years. Grunge itself arguably petered out over the first half of the decade, as we'll see, but most artists adapted to it in some way, and for sure it knocked pop music in general into a new trajectory. And of course I've described this in many previous episodes as a general enrockification of all popular music. Around this time, nearly every band that had been primarily electronic or dance-oriented came out with something that was a few steps closer to pure rock. Suddenly, dance bands rediscovered rock instruments, like Depeche Mode, and bands that were already kind of rock kicked it up a notch and flirted with metal, like Ministry. And I've talked about this quite a bit in this show. Now, where was I in all of this? I gotta say I wasn't fully on board with grunge. I like electronic music, as I think I've explained at some length. In my mind, that's where the real musical frontier is. After all, I've already heard pure rock. So in my mind, grunge bands weren't really breaking any new sonic territory. So, I was a bit bored with it all. I mean, I didn't hear anything obviously different in a band like Soundgarden than I did in a much older rock band, like, say, the Rolling Stones or Kiss, because they both had guitars, a singer, a bassist, and a drummer. And, sure, that's rock's holy lineup, I get it. And, of course, I do like some rock, for sure. But I wasn't going to drop the cooler industrial bands, say, to fully turn around and embrace grunge. Because in my mind, grunge was kind of a rehash. It was retrogressive, it wasn't progressive. And ultimately, it just didn't excite me the way this other music did. So, you know what I'm going to say next. Something happened that happens with any new big cultural movement. One person or group gets singled out as a leader. Now, how and why this happens is never clear, and I'm not sure it really has anything to do with the merits of that particular person or group, so much as maybe luck or just being in the right place at the right time. But for whatever reason, they get anointed, and thereafter are held up as the movement's figureheads, and of course it happened with grunge too. It was just a matter of time. And the fans, maybe egged on by the music press, decided that one band captured the quintessence of grunge. And not only one band, but one album of theirs, which came out in September 1991. And not only one album, really, but one song on that album. And the entire weight of grunge fandom, which by then had bled into the popular culture at large all around the earth, focused squarely on this particular song, which was, of course, Smells Like Teen Spirit from the album Nevermind by a previously little-known Seattle trio who called themselves Nirvana. All I remember of this time is that suddenly MTV seemed to only play this song, and out of nowhere, everyone had a copy of Nevermind, and they were wearing Nirvana t-shirts and, the whole deal. And I got it, right? The song was pretty powerful. I mean, straight up rock music is powerful. That's one of the things that makes it timeless and great. And I immediately grokked that part of Nirvana's charm was their wildly shifting dynamics, quiet verses, loud choruses, which were accentuated by their lead singer and guitarist's gravelly voice and screams, which I had to admit were pretty rad. And as singers go, it was clear that this guy had it. So around this time, I started playing rock music with various friends. And, after playing through the old standards that we all knew, like, Smoke on the Water and Sunshine of Your Love, we would inevitably try something a little more contemporary, like Smells Like Teen Spirit. And what sticks out in my mind is that I remember one guitarist guy that I knew, he was positively just making fun of this song because the entire verse part just consisted of playing the open E and B strings. And I remember trying to explain to him that that was pretty punk rock, keeping it so simple. But he wasn't having it. He wasn't impressed. He was, the kind of judgy guitarist who only valued shredding, complicated parts, and he didn't want to hear about punk. By osmosis, I gradually learned more and more about Nirvana, that Nevermind was their second album, the first having been Bleach, which came out in 1989, and that they were signed to the Seattle-based Sub Pop label, which was rapidly becoming the hub of all things grunge, much as Wax Trax was to industrial. That they were a power trio, with Kurt Cobain on guitar and vocals, and a tall dude named Chris Novoselic on bass, and some ponytailed guy named Dave Grohl on drums. And I learned that Grohl, who was roundly praised for his skills on the kit even back in the day, was actually their second drummer, that another guy named Chad Channing had played largely on Bleach. So over time, Nirvana would release other singles from that album, and I'd become familiar with them all, mostly from hearing them all the time on the radio, just over and over and over. Songs like Come As You Are, which borrowed a riff from Killing Joke, as I discussed back in episode 63, and Lithium, and then one of my favorites, In Bloom, and that one had a pretty clever video, and of course, MTV, being fully in the bag for Nirvana by now, played it as much as ever, and the video was kind of a juxtaposition of the band sending up the Beatles on Sullivan against them in their modern kind of world, very destructive, gender-bending Hellraisers. So a not-so-subtle commentary maybe on how far we'd come culturally in just a few decades. But the thing I noticed about Nirvana and a lot of these other grunge bands that sprung up was that most people my age were into them. They were really the dominant thing at the time. So you go to someone's house or their party, and like as not, they'd be spinning Nirvana or Soundgarden or Alice in Chains or Mudhoney or whatnot. And later in the decade, that would kind of morph into new punk-ish acts like Green Day, Rancid, and The Offspring, or even later, new metal bands like Limp Bizkit and Korn. And I can't believe I finally had to mention Limp Bizkit. So my point is that grunge and its after effects were very much in the zeitgeist. They were as much a part of the 90s as modems, slackers, and irony. And Nirvana, for whatever reason, were chosen as the apotheosis of grunge. My initial reaction to Nirvana was kind of predictable. I didn't much like them so much as tolerate them, much as I tolerated any other music that was foisted off on me by FM radio, MTV, and all the speakers in restaurants, stores, malls, and every other public place. I mean, I could appreciate that sort of music for sure, but it wasn't something that I wanted to listen to by choice. And I think I touched on this in the episode about U2's Achtung Baby, which is a great example of music that was just way overplayed, but that I could still, appreciate. So Nirvana was right with U2 in my book as far as me liking them. But what was clear, though, is that Nirvana were different in a very important way, because U2 always aspired to global superstardom. And for what it's worth, to paraphrase Andy Serkis in 24-Hour Party People, they wore it well. It didn't take a toll on them, really, because it was always part of their plan. And that was not so with Nirvana. At least that's the impression I had. I don't think Nirvana ever looked for greatness. They didn't so much wear it well as struggle under its burden. And Kurt Cobain in particular, I suppose, because the singer, for better or worse, is always the focus. And look, I'm not going to take time here to dip into that guy's mental state. I didn't know him, and I'm certainly not a Nirvana scholar. In my mind, his story is probably not so much unlike Ian Curtis's story. Young guy who is at a crux in life, finds himself a lightning rod for his generation despite never asking for it, He's put under a microscope in ways that even his bandmates can't quite grasp. And I don't think it's a coincidence either that both of these guys were new fathers when it all hit the fan. Because apart from anything else, fatherhood is a serious jolt when it's undertaken seriously. And it was maybe the most transcendent thing in my life so far. Just speaking for myself, it's one of those pivotal things that splits your life into two clear parts, the before times and the after times. So from my limited perspective, I can guess that both Kurt and Ian felt tremendous pressure, and I'll just leave it at that. So over the early part of the 90s, my relationship with Nirvana began to evolve. For one, I got more familiar with their catalog. This was spurred somewhat by my picking up the guitar and learning some of their songs, which in the great tradition of punk were all fairly simple but clever. In 1994, they played MTV Unplugged, and everyone I know watched that performance. I mean, everyone, at least in my circle, Nirvana fans and not. It was a generational moment, kind of like the Beatles on Sullivan or Hendrix's Star Spangled Banner, because MTV just played the show over and over, and we all loved it. And I bought the CD, I played along to it on my guitar, and it had a couple of my favorite songs of theirs, and both of them had simple yet very cool guitar licks. And I started to appreciate Kurt's songwriting in a way that I hadn't been able to before I had picked up the guitar. So these songs were About a Girl, which was from their first album Bleach, and All Apologies, which was from their third album In Utero. And around this time, I also picked up a copy of In Utero and got into that thing. And I also found some love for some other grunge bands, namely Alice in Chains. So much like with Nirvana, this was catalyzed by seeing them on MTV Unplugged. And in their case, I was riveted by two things. One was Sean Kinney's drums, and the other was Lane Staley's voice, maybe in that order. And I would love to talk about this record, Jar of Flies, sometime, which is maybe my favorite thing of theirs. I think it's a really exceptional listen, and I much prefer it to their more standard macho rock stuff like Man in the Box or whatever. But meanwhile, Nirvana's fame grew and grew, and we all know how it ended, right? It was another generation-defining moment, a where were you when you first heard kind of moment, and it was with Kurt, much as with Ian Curtis, tragically taking his own life on April 5th, 1994. And did it affect me? Not directly, certainly. It might have affected me maybe just a bit more than any other untimely celebrity death. I guess I was mostly struck by how sad it was that this guy ostensibly had it all, but he was still miserable, and that he chose a permanent solution to what was likely a temporary problem. After all, fame is fleeting, and it's a fact that Nirvana wasn't going to stay on top forever. There's just no way that could happen. So it was inevitable that something else would eventually come along and knock grunge on its head. And at the end of the day, in retrospect, what was that? Well, it was saccharine pop, as I recall. Boy bands and the Spice Girls, and everyone just put their guitars and drums away and brought back the backing tracks. And strangely, all that crap appealed mostly to the next generation, I think, the millennials, I suppose, not Gen X. So where did Gen X go after grunge? I guess more into rap rock and nu metal, I suppose, though I didn't personally. And, eventually we all got into the next rock revival, which was led by the White Stripes and the Hives and the Vines and the Killers and, dozens of other bands with names that all started with the. And, around and around we go. Rock revivals are just a cyclic thing, and they're just broken up, as we know, by endless novel flavors of the month. But anyway, after Kurt's death, Nirvana's spring slowly wound down, and there were the inevitable posthumous collections. But really, there was a remarkable lack of looking back for the surviving members, because Chris and Dave would take very different paths into the future. Chris largely by leaving the spotlight, undertaking occasional musical collaborations, but, largely living a relatively quiet life in rural Washington state. And Dave by founding, against all odds, a band that was even more successful than Nirvana in some ways, a band that has elevated him from being that drummer from Nirvana into being a respected and revered elder statesman of rock. Someone who has played a role much like Johnny Appleseed or maybe Forrest Gump, having a hand in many of the famous rock acts of the past 3 decades. And a guy who, again, is in that rarest of categories, the artist who is beloved by all. You know, it's a small club that I talk about now and then in this show, and we all know who's in it. Weird Al, ZZ Top, Tom Petty, and I'd argue Dave Grohl. And by extension, the band that he founded, the Foo Fighters, who have not only brought the rock for the last quarter century, but maybe more importantly, have brought us all their love of rock by being everywhere, by being positive and enthusiastic, by playing tons of covers and giving respect to all the bands that influence them, by just collaborating with tons of bands, by making their live shows exciting and interactive, and bringing ordinary people on stage, and just by making every appearance an event, a celebration of the redemptive power of rock and roll. So through his efforts, I'd say Dave is approaching a level of respect and genuineness that, I gotta say, rivals that of one of his greatest heroes, that singular avatar of all things rock and roll, the one, the only, the eternal Lemmy Kilmister. You never ever hear a bad word about Dave or Lemmy, and for the same reasons. And I like to think that Dave is, in a slightly more sustainable, but no less authentic way, carrying the torch for rock now that Lemmy is off playing the great gig in the sky. Speaking of, I was genuinely struck when Dave's longtime friend and fellow Foo Fighter Taylor Hawkins died just a couple of years ago at the way too young age of 50. I would say that Taylor's death affected me more than Kurt's did, maybe because I was closer to his age, maybe because I felt like I knew him a bit more, because I'd seen him in endless interviews with Dave, always at his side, the two always laughing and joking together, like when they inducted Rush into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And much like Dave, Taylor just seemed like a great guy, just funny and down to earth. So I thought it really did suck when he died so young, and I'm not going to lie, that was a pretty lousy day. Now, let's take a step back. I haven't done a great job keeping up with my old college friends, so I'm in touch with about 4 people from high school, but really none from college for whatever reason. So for me, Nirvana, the band, is just like another college friend because I haven't kept up, I just haven't kept up. And the albums of theirs that I bought, I sold them all long ago back when I needed the cash. And I stopped listening to the radio decades ago, of course, when iPods first came out. And, I hardly ever hear Nirvana in public like I used to do. So that said, I did have an epiphany of sorts a few years ago. So this was, I don't know what it was, 21 or 22. It was the summer, and I was at the beach walking up the boardwalk, and just like you'd bump into an old school friend out of nowhere, I suddenly heard this song on the loudspeakers. I didn't recognize it right away, but it was very familiar, and I probably looked pretty strange standing there for a few seconds trying to place it. And the funny thing was, I knew it was a song that I could play on guitar. I could still feel the chord changes, even if I couldn't remember exactly what they were. And I thought, oh yeah, it's Nirvana. It's one of those great songs from the Unplugged album, but which one? Because I hadn't thought of them in years. So, I stood there and I was singing along and strumming some air guitar, as you do, and I finally remembered that it was about a girl, and it just instantly took me back almost 30 years to listening to that tune in my little dorm room and strumming along on my $4 acoustic guitar, just trying to figure it out. It was exactly the feeling of running into an old friend, of just being happy to see that they're well and that they've aged gracefully, of just reminding yourself of all the good times you shared. And it all happened in an eye blink. So I did teach myself the song over again, and I'd found myself dipping back into Nirvana's catalog a bit. And to that end, I picked up this very convenient self-titled Best Of compilation and kind of went down the old rabbit hole and watched all the old videos again, the MTV Unplugged performance, and in watching that, I know it sounds stupid, but I really marveled at how young Dave and Chris looked and how just completely ordinary Kurt looked. Of course. And just reflecting on that a bit, thinking of how long ago this really was, like 30 years, almost half a lifetime. And just thinking again of what a damn shame it was that Kurt was gone, because wow, what a waste. I don't think there's anything cool or romantic about it. It's just freaking sad. I think about his family, especially his young kid, just as with, Ian Curtis and his young kid, just leaving a big hole in that kid's life. These guys just, missed out on so much, and it just sucks for them and everyone around them. There's just no other way to think about it. But I got to say, it was fun to go back and listen to these songs again. And for me, not having listened to them in so long, they were kind of like a time capsule. They just opened up a bunch of memories and feelings that I haven't really considered in decades. And that doesn't happen quite to that extent as much anymore. So it was really cool. These days, this CD mostly sits in my shelf. I think I did work through my Nirvana kick, although who knows, maybe it'll come around again. Now and then my kids will mention the Foo Fighters, or their friends will come over wearing Nirvana t-shirts, particularly the one with the smiley face logo, which, now that I think about it, was that some kind of statement against all the rave culture? I don't know. Is there a story behind that? I don't know. Maybe someone here can tell me. All I know is that shirt is still pretty popular with the kids, and I half wonder if any of them even listen to Nirvana, or if they're just wearing it for the same reason they're all wearing Pink Floyd or AC/DC shirts, because there's a big pile of vintage band shirts in any Walmart or Target. Maybe it's just a fashion thing. I don't know. I'm not cool enough to say. Hopefully at least a few of these kids are actually listening to the music. So that brings us to the present day. Like I said, I just got back from visiting Seattle, so this was my second trip there in 20 years, so 2004 and 2024. And, we did all the touristy stuff again, but this time we brought the kids along. What were my impressions? Well, once again, it was all about coffee, books, and salmon. I was happy none of that changed. Overall, I have to say I was pretty impressed with the artwork that I saw all around the city, because everywhere we went, there were amazing murals, street art, some of it literally on the surface of the street, as well as on walls and buildings. And there were just really cool and funny stickers everywhere. I don't know, I got a kick out of that. Some people might consider it vandalism, but I enjoyed the stickers. But, unfortunately, every surface of the city was also covered in just plain old graffiti tags, which that kind of sucked. I mean, if you're going to do graffiti, at least make it imaginative and put some effort into it. But by and large, there was a ton of cool art everywhere. The city, for sure, wasn't boring to look at. In fact, it sometimes seemed like there were two opposed factions. There was one trying to make the city beautiful and one trying to ruin it. And, from what I could tell, the first group was winning by a hair. But we were also impressed with the green space and the gardens, particularly with people's yards in the residential areas. And we went all around the city in different neighborhoods, and I got to say, I hardly saw any yards that weren't obviously cared for. And I saw plenty that were super cool. Like one had a tiny little plot with a treehouse on it. And another had a slack line with a full ninja course on it. And no, we didn't actually do that. That would have been bad. But people didn't have a lot of space, but they did a lot with it, which was kind of inspiring, and it was great to check out. Frink Park was also a great surprise. Who knew there was an actual forest full of trails in the city with a giant sequoia, no less. The restaurants were really great too, but I got to say, wow, everything there was just way more expensive than it is here in the Northeast. I mean, of course, we did a bit of grocery shopping to defray the costs, but even that put a hole in my wallet. And for real, gas was like $5 a gallon, so that was just insane. We hit Mopop, and I was happy to see that they did in fact keep the jam rooms from the old EMP, so we were able to grab a room and rock out a bit, which was a total blast. We also did the Space Needle, of course, which was, definitely a place you can go. And, of course, we almost got hit by a flying fish in the Pike Place Market, and I noticed that the old gum wall has now turned into a whole gum alley, which was pretty funny. And I visited my favorite bookstore, Left Bank Books, which is right there in the market. And a more activist bookstore you will never visit. I loved every aspect of that place personally, and I recommend it to anyone. From someone coming from the fairly rural East Coast, I have to say it was refreshing. And let's not forget that this is the store where Tobias Forge found a book on imperial dynasties that inspired Ghost's Impera album. A little known fact. So yeah, Tobias Forge is also down with Left Bank Books. We visited a lot of bookstores, in fact, and I was happy to see that the zine community in Seattle is as strong as ever. I was just talking about that in the previous episode, the one about Morkborg, where, they publish a lot of their content in zine form, and wondering if anyone else did that these days. And yeah, there were just tons of cool zines to check out there. In fact, I picked up this 35th anniversary of Comet Bus, too, which was great. Also, I just got to say that I was pleasantly surprised at how ubiquitous the Pride flags and Black Lives Matter flags were all around the town. Again, a refreshing change from the Northeast, and who knows, maybe a bellwether of things to come. Strangely enough, though, I found very few references to Nirvana in my wanderings. Of course, there was like a Sub Pop store in the airport, but, I'm not counting that. One day we happened to be in a store and saw a Nirvana t-shirt for sale, and another day, I swear, we saw a shop downtown called Come As You Are, and we made a joke about it, but who knows, that might have been a coincidence. But then on the last day, we went to Mopop, and naturally they had a full Nirvana exhibit, and that was really cool. The thing that really blew me away was that they had some of the guitars that the band used in the MTV Unplugged gig, like Christ's bass and that red, white, and blue guitar that was pretty iconic that Pat Smear played. And it was just wild to see those instruments in person because I remembered seeing them on TV. And of course, they had a lot of handwritten notes and actual snapshots taken by the band and, the remains of a guitar that Kurt had destroyed and just all these little bits of real ephemera. So, I was glad to finally get a dose of grunge while visiting the town. Overall, I was really impressed with Seattle, even though it for sure has some rough edges. We saw a handful of pretty awful things, I'm not going to lie, kind of as you do in any big city, surely. But it was clear that the town had a heart. There are people there who care about other people. They also care about culture and beauty, and with providing everyone with a chance to live a good and healthy life. And there were also plenty of examples of people from very different cultures getting along and interacting in a positive way. And maybe the whole place was a bit more heterogeneous than I'm used to seeing, where I live. Maybe it was a bit more upfront about recognizing differences and working together in spite of them. And I gotta say, that was great to see. I try not to be a cynical guy, but you read enough news and it's hard not to be. So for me, Seattle has bucked that trend a bit and helped restore my faith in humanity to some extent. Well, there you have it, folks. As a card-carrying member of Generation X, I had to address it sooner or later. Our musical and cultural heritage, more or less. Nirvana, Seattle, and grunge. As much a part of the 90s as Bill Clinton playing sax on Arsenio Hall. The Simpsons put it best, as they usually did back in the day. Why don't we all move to Seattle and use slow modems? For sure, you could have a worse idea. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast. The show that didn't even tell the story of how I almost got to play in a band with Chris Novoselic. This was back in 2004 in that first trip. After I bumped into a random guitarist in Skamaqua, Washington, we got talking about music, and I told this guy I played drums, as you do. And then he says, "Wow, man, me and Chris could have used you for our gig a few days ago since we didn't have a drummer." Only to find out he meant Chris Novoselic. So that was equal parts awesome and awful, as you can imagine. Well, Chris, if you're listening to this, it was no big loss for you because I'm no Dave Grohl. So it probably wouldn't have worked out. Probably. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay strong.